If an individual is unable to assimilate or accommodate an event or an action within existing schemas, a personal conceptual framework through which we achieve an understanding of self and others, our moral integrity, she will experience guilt, shame, and anxiety. She will believe herself to be immoral, irredeemable, and irreparable. Moral guilt is the painful cognitive, emotional experience tied to an awareness of having transgressed personal or shared convictions and the anxiety precipitated by a perceived breakdown of their ethical cohesion, their integrity, and an alienation from the moral community. Shame is the loss of self-esteem and or expected negative evaluation by valued others, or ourselves, consequent to a failure to live up to personal and communal expectations. In his landmark study of the behavior of U.S. infantry soldiers during World War II, General S.L.A. Marshall reported that only 15 to 20% of men in battle, now even those facing immediate threat, actually fired their weapons at the enemy. Richard Gabriel points out that although the primitive and warlike New Guinean tribesmen are excellent marksmen with their bows during hunting, when they go to war, the warriors remove the feathers from the arrow, rendering their weapons relatively ineffective and keeping casualties low. Similarly, among many Native American tribes, it brought the warrior more respect and esteem merely to touch the enemy, count coup, rather than to kill him. A study conducted by the British Operational Analysis Establishment in 1986 analyzed more than 100 19th and 20th century battles and concluded that the killing potential of the forces engaged in these battles were much greater than the recorded casualty rate achieved. How is that? Well, they explain this phenomena as indicating an unwillingness by the participants to take part in the combat as the main factor. Ample evidence exists, therefore, to support the contention that soldiers on the battlefield throughout the history of warfare avoided killing their counterparts if at all possible. Marshall concludes from his study that, and I quote, "It is therefore reasonable to believe that the average and healthy individual, the man who can endure the mental and physical stresses of combat, still has such an inner and usually unrealized resistance towards killing a fellow man, that he will not of his own volition take life, if it is possible to turn away from that responsibility." End of quote. Psychologist and former Army Ranger Colonel David Grossman is more specific. He maintains that there exists in humankind a natural and innate reluctance towards killing members of one's own species. He writes, "There is within most men an intense resistance to killing their fellow man, a resistance so strong that in many circumstances soldiers on the battlefield will die before they can overcome it." End of quote. As may be expected, the prevalence of moral injuries suffered by those who fought in morally ambiguous wars or in counter-insurgency guerrilla wars, asymmetrical wars, such as in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, where, for example, the distinction between combatant and non-combatant is obscure as best, will be significantly greater and the symptoms more severe. However, all war yields moral casualties. J. Glenn Gray, close to my heart, a philosopher and intelligence officer during World War II, writes of an incident in which an elderly couple accused of being Gestapo agents had committed suicide following his having questioned them harshly. He writes, and I quote, "The incident affected me strongly and still does. I was directly or indirectly the cause of their deaths. I hope it will not rest too hard on my conscience, and yet, if it does not, I shall be disturbed as well." End of quote. Gray's insights are especially valuable as they illustrate that even the action and experiences of those involved in the good war, remember, World War II was the good war, and not directly confronting the enemy on the battlefield, can precipitate moral injury. Consequently, those military theorists, and there are many of those, who have argued that debilitating remorse, guilt, and shame, moral injury, may be avoided by educating soldiers, probably attempting to convince them is better, about the justness or necessity of war and the appropriateness of their combat behavior, could benefit from Gray's observations. I will interpret the empirical evidence as indicating at least that rational men and women have, for whatever the reason, accepted, internalized, and acted upon a standard of behavior that proscribes killing members of one's own species, the principle of respect for persons. If, in fact, humankind is biologically predisposed to respond using violence to certain external stimuli, such a predisposition has been effectively offset by the societal mores and ethical values instilled in us and we have internalized during childhood. Human beings, then, are not killers by nature. Soldiers are not born killers. Killers have to be created. Political and military leaders whose aim it is to further their national goals and objectives through violence have recognized that this reluctance to kill, this foundational aspect of the human being's moral identity, jeopardizes their ability to wage war effectively, and we cannot have that. Consequently, following the Second World War, warrior preparation, basic training boot camp was modified to shift its focus from acquainting soldiers with tactics and weaponry to rather sophisticated techniques of value manipulation, moral desensitization, and psychological conditioning, aimed at destroying and overriding the recruit's moral aversion to killing. The goals of this modified basic training are fivefold. First, late adolescents, young adults undergoing an important psychosocial stage in personality development are, through rigid discipline, dehumanization, and intense physical, psychological, and emotional manipulation, pressure, and abuse, reduced to a state of extreme helplessness and vulnerability in order to effect what I term moral identity disassociation and conversion. That is, the destruction of their non-martial moral identity with its appropriate beliefs, values, and loyalties, and attributes of character, such as kindness and mercy and compassion and consideration and benevolence and forgiveness and charity and sympathy, in favor of, to be replaced by, the beliefs, values, loyalties, and attributes of character appropriate to their new identity as warrior. Loyalty to comrade, courage, patriotism, obedience, brutality, cruelty, viciousness, ferocity, inhumanity, ruthlessness, etc. We have many new shows on TV and many wonderful motion pictures that idolize the adventures of the SEALs. Why is it that we love the SEALs so much? Well, it's not because of their use of reason and their rationality. It's because they are such elite, brutal killers. They're good at it, and we idolize that, and we hold it up for them as a model for our children. These are our heroes. This is whom you are supposed to emulate. This is what you want to be like. Second, the reality of combat is such that few men or women kill or are willing to die for ideology, issues of justice, God, or country. What ultimately motivates soldiers to kill and to die in battle is personal honor, self-respect, and their loyalty and accountability to their comrades. Consequently, basic military training seeks destruction of the recruit's concept of themselves as individuals, and fosters instead a group identity and esprit de corps, a unit, cohesion, or brotherhood, sisterhood of the warrior. This phenomena, sociologically termed grouping or crowding, also allows for the development of a sense of anonymity, a diffusion of responsibility, and a group absolution, thereby lessening, at least temporarily, a sense of personal responsibility for their actions. It is, therefore, the recruit's own vision of themselves as part of a select group of warriors with a proud, noble, and chivalrous tradition, a dynamic I turn to warrior mythology, that effectively enables them to ignore the ethical limit they would normally place upon the use of violence. And look, I know this from personal experience. When I was about this high, there was nothing other than what I wanted to do than to become a Marine. And from the time I can remember, it's all I used to play war games. John Wayne was my hero. I loved Sands of Iwo Jima. I must have watched that movie 20 times. That's what I wanted to do. That's what I wanted to be. So I was on that road. I was going there. So it didn't take too much, I think, to get me to pick it all up. Third, while the military alleges not to want to create automata, and the official military position is that blind obedience is not the goal of warrior preparation, soldiers remain, at least theoretically, morally and legally responsible to differentiate lawful from unlawful orders and are bound only to obey the former. But in reality, most sincere and pragmatic military leaders would agree that an immediate response to orders on the battlefield is an absolute necessity. Essentially, then, basic military training conditions recruits to respond to orders immediately, automatically, and without question. The Tennyson quote from the Charge of the Light Brigade, "Ours is not to reason why, ours is but to do and die," certainly captures the reality of military discipline. Fourth, to be successful in battle, recruits must develop an immediate killing response. Basic military training, therefore, programs recruits. Notice I say programs, and I don't say trains, because this is not about training. This is about programming. This is about conditioning. This is about brainwashing. I was in a discussion once with I hesitate to use the term philosopher, but he was a philosopher who worked at the West Point, and he was also a combat veteran, and he, in a conversation with me, had no problem using the expression brainwashing. And when he used it, he floored me. Not that I didn't understand that it was brainwashing, I just never expected them to admit it. But they do, and they're okay with that. And there is a sense in which I can understand that. Because as long as you want armies, as long as you want to fight wars, you don't want to send you and I there. You want to give people the best chance, the best shot of surviving that insanity. So you got to create these individuals who are going to do what's necessary to kill the enemy and come back alive. And we celebrate that. And we celebrate that. So we program recruits utilizing a number of clearly Skinnerian, Pavlovian stimulus response conditioning exercises. Utilizing operant conditioning techniques such as reflexive fire training, recruits are conditioned to react automatically and without hesitation to an enemy and kill him. Success is rewarded with praise and medals. Those that are unsuccessful suffer the wrath of the drill instructor, the guilt and shame of letting down their peers, and the possibility of failing to graduate from basic training. Fifth, war is inevitably overwhelming, and killing another human being an awesome act antithetical to ordinary conceptions of morality. Consequently, an important goal of basic training is to create distance between the warrior and those they must kill by accentuating, fabricating the enemy's cultural, racial, ethnic, and moral differences. That is, to instill in the recruits an abstract perception of the enemy as evil, demonic, subhuman, non-human, and socially inferior. When you are training, and even when you are fighting, you never refer to the people that you are trying, the entities that you are trying to kill as human beings, as people. We have to employ racist terms, dehumanizing terms. In Vietnam, gook, slant, dink, now the haji, towel head, World War II, kraut, nip. So we're not going to refer to them as human beings because it's so difficult to kill human beings, but much easier to kill non-human entities. When I went to Vietnam, I didn't go to Vietnam to kill human beings. I went there to exorcise demons. At some point where they fucked me up. Because all of a sudden, those demons I was exorcising became human beings. When did that happen? And how did that happen? When we were running groups, it was okay within the group to continue to use those terms, at least initially. Because I knew it was overwhelming for them, trying to deal with basic issues, to all of a sudden have to confront the humanity of the other. As Beth told the story of the Vietnam veteran, seeing the picture of, that guy's just like me. He's a human being just like me. I was told he's some kind of subhuman or demon. There's a classic scene. In my mind, there's two great books about war, and both happen to be novels. One is All Quiet on the Western Front, #1, and #2 is The Things They Carry. And All Quiet on the Western Front, there's one wonderful scene where the hell was his name? Paul. Thank you. Yeah. Paul was involved in an assault and then running back. That's what they do on the Western Front. They assault, they come back, then they assault. Well, they assaulted. On the way back, Paul had to jump into a bomb crater in order to survive. So he was huddled there, waiting for some lull in the action for him to get back. Well, just about then, the French, our German, Paul was a German, which is interesting because they were the enemy. So at that point, the French, they started their assault, and they were repulsed. And on their way back, one of their soldiers jumped into the hole as well. The immediate reaction was to kill him. So Paul pulled out his knife and killed the guy. Unfortunately for Paul, perhaps, he didn't die right away. Paul had to see him now as a human being. And he also had pictures of his kids that he took out. Paul gave them water. And it's a great, great scene. Brother, I didn't want to kill you. You could be just like Kaz, one of the friends. We could have a beer together. Why? Why don't they tell us that you have mothers and sisters and brothers and girlfriends just like us? Why don't they tell us that? Well, they don't tell you that because then you will kill them. There's a famous, wonderful, wonderful story of the Christmas truce. Are you familiar with the Christmas truce on the Western Front? Oh, such a great story. It was Christmas Eve. You know what the Western Front was like? There was massive, what do you call those things? Trenches on one side, and some of them were, you could throw stuff across to the Germans and to the French and the English. So one Christmas Eve, one of the Germans put up a kind of a Christmas tree on top of the lip of the bunker. And the Germans started singing Christmas carols. And the British, on the other side, heard it as well. And they started singing their Christmas carols. They started to look up at each other, both sides. At one point, one very brave soul on the German side got up and started to walk across the killing zone, the no man's land. One Brit was trying to kill him. The other one said, "Stop. Don't kill him." And he got up, and he walked out to the middle of the no man's land. And they shook hands. And they exchanged cigarettes and meat in a can. And they started to talk. And then other Germans got up. And then other Brits got up. And they had this wonderful meeting of human beings. They saw themselves as truly who they were. They helped each other retrieve their dead and bring them back. In a couple of hours, they were playing soccer on this killing zone and this no man's land. Needless to say, when the leadership on both sides saw what was going on, they really got upset. We can't have this. We can't have this. They ended up having to fire artillery into the middle there just to get people to go back. Many of the troops the following day refused to resume the war. They weren't going to kill them. I know those people. I'm not killing them. They had to actually replace those troops, send them to the rear, and replace them with fresher recruits. This is what happens when we do away with the demonizing of the enemy, when we see human beings and people for what they are. We don't want to kill them. That's what Marshall was talking about. It is clear, therefore, that since the end of the Second World War, nations have entered a new era in warrior preparation. These indoctrination techniques, characterized by profound psychological and value manipulation and conditioning, have proven quite successful indeed. As studies indicate that the percentage of soldiers in battle who fired their weapons at the enemy increased to around 55% during the Korean War and to 95% during Vietnam. Now, I don't know of any study that's been done on troops in Iraq and Afghanistan and Somalia and Kenya and the other myriad of places that no one knows what they're doing there. But there's no reason to believe that these soldiers are any less lethal than we were in Vietnam. So upon completing basic training, most soldiers view themselves as part of a select group of courageous knights with a noble and chivalric tradition, willing, programmed to kill the demonic agents of evil and selflessly to sacrifice their lives if need be for right and justice. I know I was. With combat, however, as the screams of the mutilated and the dying quickly replace the sounds of inspiring hymns and the chaos, insanity, and horror of the battlefield become apparent, comes the realization that however just the goal and righteous the initial intent, as William Tecumseh Sherman aptly described it, and I quote, "War is destruction and nothing else. It is cruelty and you cannot refine it." End of quote. Consequently, as the warrior's mythology begins to crumble, ideology and the lofty and abstract ideals of chivalry, patriotism become irrelevant. War becomes a struggle for personal survival and revenge. Confronted by this reality, serious doubts and moral uneasiness arise regarding war's necessity and the justness and the nobility and the righteousness of the warrior's involvement. Tragically, as warriors experience the horror and cruelty of war, the moral gravity of their actions become apparent. As a consequence, whether this occurs after the fact, after having returned home, or while still in theater, the deception is inevitably revealed. The mythology is destroyed, and the warrior is left to confront not only the effects of trauma, but the anguish and the grief, the moral distress and confusion at having violated the deep-seated principle of respect for persons so integral to their pre-programming moral identity. This is a quote from Euripides. As indicated by this quote from Euripides' Heracles, The observation that some human beings become moral casualties because of their experiences in war is not new. Historically, many societies have recognized war's deleterious moral effects and required returning warriors to undergo elaborate atonement and purification rituals, quarantine, penances, that sort of thing. These therapies provided the means and the opportunity for the returning warriors to cope with the moral enormity of his actions in combat. Tragically, the moral injuries of modern warriors, however, have been virtually ignored, overlooked, or disregarded by the conventional therapeutic community, operating as it does within a Nietzschean, Freudian scientific legacy that views ethical concerns as clinically irrelevant. Autonomous man ought to feel no guilt nor bite of conscience for his actions. Focusing instead upon stress and trauma, most moral symptoms presented by returning soldiers are either not taken seriously or assimilated under the diagnostic umbrella of post-traumatic stress disorder. Consequently, the veterans received a signal that an inability to forget, an inability to put the war behind them, is either weakness or perhaps worse, illness. Accordingly, veterans are advised to ignore what has occurred, to de-responsibilize. That is, to neutralize their feelings by accepting the naturalness of their behavior in a specialized environment like the battlefield, and or to undergo a myriad of conventional therapies intended to enable them to deal with the stress and trauma of their experiences. In either approach, moral considerations are for the most part irrelevant. Unfortunately, in most cases, moral injury neither responds well to conventional therapies or to medication, nor can it be rationalized away. In fact, such methods, according to psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, one of my heroes, tend to alienate the individual still further. Such therapeutic advice as forget it, live with it, act as though it never happened. Don't worry, human beings act that way in survival situations. Just go on with your life. How many times has veterans heard that? Does little to alleviate the veterans' moral pain and suffering. To those struggling to survive the next improvised explosive device or suicide bomber, war's negative effects are pervasive and cumulative. Every day living in a war zone is another world of horror and insanity in which respect for life becomes a liability and atrocity a matter of perspective. As an inevitable consequence, participants are dehumanized and desensitized to death and destruction. Judgments of right and wrong, law and morality quickly become irrelevant, and brutality and atrocity a primal response to an overwhelming threat of annihilation. Life amid the violence, death, horror, trauma, anxiety, and fatigue of war erodes our moral being, undoes character, and reduces decent men and women to savages capable of incredible cruelty that would never have been possible before being victimized and sacrificed to war.